Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. We have almost survived ADC. We're on to the last keynote of the conference, and I'm really chuffed to be able to introduce Paul Bamborough here. Now, Paul has had an amazingly interesting career, being everything from a psychologist and a filmmaker to starting multiple huge, interesting, successful technology companies. When I first came down to London back in the mid-90s to seek my fortune as a programmer, the interesting place to work at the time was Paul's company, Lightworks, which is where I ended up, and I met Paul. And we've kind of stayed in touch ever since. And we generally meet up every now and then to have a cup of tea and spend a few hours just whinging on about how terrible everything else is that everybody else does and how we could do it all better. And I think we kind of get on because we both have the same attitude to creating products, which is you're trying to get on with something, you get really frustrated and annoyed with how bad everything is, and you just think, oh, for God's sake, I could do this better myself. And so then you think, well, I'm going to do it better myself. And most of the things I've done in my career have been inspired by that. And I think I take Paul as my inspiration for that attitude. So he's going to talk about what are you doing really? And yeah, big round of applause, please, Paul Bamborough.
Thank you. I can't hear my own voice, so I'm assuming you can hear me perfectly clearly. Oh, I just went into feedback. I know this because it's audio. You know. So yeah, thank you very much, Julian. That was more of an introduction than I deserve. So the theme, what are you doing really? And I'm fighting this. Yeah, thoughts on finding true purposes in the underbrush of rules, processes, and methodologies. This evening, I shall be enumerating a number of my own experiences, showing how they might apply to the subject at hand. Everybody in this entire room has already read this entire slide before you had time to speak the first line. So stop reading, turn around, and talk to the audience. Okay, well, so what am I doing really? Well, what I'm not doing really is in any way, oh, this is interesting, in any way related to PowerPoint. I loathe PowerPoint. And PowerPoint is your perfect example of something which is a perfectly useful tool. It's a perfectly, it's a convenient way of putting stuff together. And it then took over as a process instead of the original product, which was the sharing of information. And that's what I'm doing, really. I'm passing on some information which I hope will be useful to you. And on a side note to that, when Lou Gerstner in 1990-ish moved in to take over IBM, which was floundering hopelessly in the wake of the personal computer revolution, had no idea what it was doing, his first act, according to history, is to abolish PowerPoint presentations. They weren't allowed anymore, and IBM has been doing jolly well ever since. So yeah, I'm sort of here under false pretenses. I'm not an audio developer. I've been involved in audio companies. I was one of the founders of Solid State Logic, which is definitely an audio company, but I never did any audio development there. What I was involved with was the ergonomics, and that's my primary interest. And I'm going to this evening talk about the subject of what are you doing really through the lens of that, and it's going to be sort of chronological things that have happened to me and how they might apply to this, and hope that it'll be some use to you. It makes it easy for me because I can more or less remember what I did, more or less in what order, except for some of the slightly more stressy parts, which are all a great technicolor blur of crap. So, yeah, how did I get into this in the first place? I was going to be a cognitive psychologist. And I went to work for one of the key people in the field was a professor called Jerome Bruner at Harvard. And the idea of cognitive psychology is, stripped down to its essence, is that the brain is a device for making models of the world, putting those models together and making something out of it. And importantly here, that the world, as far as we're concerned, all of us here, me, you, anyone, you don't live in an absolute world, you only live in the models. And this has enormous implications for almost everything, and it certainly has enormous implications for software design. Because in those days, we'd hardly ever seen computers. I never saw a computer at a particular point except to play Space War on a PDP-10 at MIT. But at MIT, they were already doing graphical user interfaces. There was a thing called the Architecture Machine Group, who did, out of whom quite a few people came. But I was off just doing cognitive psychology, and during the course of that, my particular subject was babies, newborn babies. How did they start developing their models of the world? Do they have any models of the world when they're first born? One of the things we thought would be interesting would be to see what the little babies were looking at. Very difficult to do, can't use ordinary eye movement recorders because you can't explain to them why. So we looked around and we discovered that Honeywell, American corporation, had built a gun sight for helicopters in Vietnam. You looked at the Viet Cong, you pressed the button, they died. That was the idea. Luckily, it didn't work. But we wangled an invitation to a television program, in, yeah, that's the shorthand for cognitive psychology, by the way. A television program called Tomorrow's World. We looked at this thing, we worked out how it had to operate, and so we built one. And to do that, we had to learn about computers, so I got interested in that. And so at this point, I've been watching computers ever since, and I gradually gave up cognitive psychology. But it is true to say that ever since then, the synthesis of cognitive psychology and neuroscience and information theory is now telling us something about the world which is quite fundamental and informs everything. And I've recently become very interested in this again. In fact, a few years ago, a couple of years now, I was sitting in a room with some professors in Cambridge, and they were explaining some of the cool stuff they were doing at the moment. And one of them told me about the nervous system of a little roundworm called C. elegans, which is the only thing we actually have mapped the entire nervous system of. 37% of its bodily cells, of which are only 980, are nerves, and that's quite interesting to know why. And as we went through the day, I suddenly found myself saying, actually, you know, I think it's become possible to trace a direct line from this little creature. There it is, C. elegans, 330 neurons. They've been modeled in software, a lot of them. We're pretty much making a real worm. You can trace a direct line all the way from that to why Donald Trump is becoming president of the United States. That's not a C. elegans. And we all laughed, and I couldn't work out afterwards why I'd said that until later on I realized it was true. And I mean, I've actually written a short book about this now. And that's informed a lot of my thinking ever since. And we might, if we have time, return to that, or we might, if you're lucky, not. So I'm sorry, I only have one power supply, and this one keeps going out on me. Okay, so there I am. Everything is a model. We live in a model of the world. And then, of course, when you start looking at computer interfaces, they are all about moving the world into machines. And there is, by the same token, that there is no, that you only live in your models of the world. There is a very, very blurry line between physical things and virtual things. This is a very commonplace thing now. I mean, you know, it's routine to speculate that we live in a virtual universe. But nevertheless, in spite of the fact that we know that this is very commonplace, we have a tendency not to feel it in our everyday lives. But it's true. So a user interface on screen, a graphical user interface, is a thing you can interact with in the same way that knobs on a console are things you can interact with, or words are things you can use to interact with. And there's ultimately very little difference between these. They're all information one way or another. So, I mean, so for example, when people started using mice, a mouse is a way of modeling the use of your hand in another environment, but notice that a mouse has only got a couple of buttons, which makes it a truncated, nasty hand. And if you're Steve Jobs, and determined as he was in the 1980s, a mouse has only one button, which makes it into a fist. So suddenly we're using something that we are able to interact with the world with in a very complex way, quite naturally, in a much more crude way, and a lot of that has happened ever since. So what were you doing really? Well, you thought you were moving pointers around a screen, but you're not. You're interacting with something. And just as a general rule, the more closely the ways in which you're interacting with objects map onto things that you're familiar with, whether they are previously existing physical things or recently existing software things or any combination thereof, the easier it is to deal with it without having to make brand new models of stuff, which is what you don't want to be trying to do, and I'm going to return to that. But before I return to that, I'm going to talk a little tiny bit of how I got into the reason I'm standing here today, really, which is that during this period, I was getting bored with cognitive psychology, but I was supposed to be doing a DPhil, a PhD, which I never finished. But I persuaded Oxford, where I was at that point, to let me be at the National Film School and learn how to direct. And at the film school, in parallel then, we had a Neve console. Now, some of you may know them, the company's Focus right now. And they had the first computer thing to help you do mixing, which was a very handy thing. And they sent us a brochure for it in case the school would want to buy one. And I looked at it, and the way you, for example, were to play a song is that you would play the tape, move to a point, mark it as a cue point, to which was automatically assigned a number, find the other end of the song, mark another cue point, which would be automatically assigned another number, not necessarily in sequence, and then you would enter the first cue point number into the from field, and then you would enter the last cue point number into the to field, and then you would press some button or other, and it would play that song. And I looked at that, and this is essentially what Julian was saying. I thought, Jesus Christ, there's got to be a better way than this, because what are you doing really? Well, you're not entering cue points, are you? What you're doing really is you're playing a song. So we designed a system. There were no graphical user interfaces, really. Well, there were, but I didn't know about them. And we'll return to that, too. I designed a system which used words, buttons with words on it. We integrated a keypad into the middle of the console. We integrated a screen into the middle of the console, which was a complete bastard in those days because it was a traditional CRT and it wanted to get into the audio bus. It had to be put in two separate mu metal boxes, one inside the other. And you wanted to play a song called Jim. You would go play song Jim, or J would be enough if there weren't any other songs beginning with Jim. And that's not difficult, and you might be sitting here thinking, well, that's sort of trivial, but the point is that wasn't the way people were thinking. They were thinking in computery terms, and one way or another, people have thought in computery terms ever since. They've just become gradually more sophisticated computery terms, but this need to look for what you're really trying to do in the first place still persists, and it's still overlooked a lot. So there we were, and that worked out well, and what I gradually became fairly aware of was that, and this is hindsight, I didn't know this, but it was indeed all this stuff I've said about cognitive modeling, was that anything you interact with has some form of personality. In the case, say, of the things you check out with at a supermarket, this is a loathsome personality. If you imagine being opposite a shop assistant who interacted with you the way these machines do, there would be a lot of punching going on in the world. So what we were looking at was something that was domain-specific, musicians, attitude-specific, musicians, and was intended to be their friend. And one afternoon, I was thinking about that, and I was thinking the error messages on computers always say things like grammatical, grammar error, do not understand, not a well-formed sentence. And I thought, these people don't like this. This isn't their life. This isn't how you talk to people. So I built an insult generator. It was randomly. It started from very mild, short insults, and you could set it at different levels of floridity. And some of the more extreme insults would go on for 20 or 30 words, getting ruder and ruder and ruder. It took about 3 hours, start to finish. I reckon we sold $100 million worth of consoles off that one. And that, $100 million was money in those days. We're looking back 30 years. I know now everyone in this room makes that every weekend, but that was a lot of money in those days. And so because the thing had become the friend of the people, as it were, of these particular people, and that's user interface. It just isn't immediately obviously so. Also, there are times when it isn't. At the NAB show in 1982, I'm sorry to be digging so far into the past, it must seem like before anyone was born here, but believe me, everybody were the same people, they were just at a different time. One of our guys demonstrated the system to Donny Osmond and didn't switch the insults off. Donny Osmond is a Mormon. That was a sale we really didn't make. But things were good for us at that particular time, and we survived. But you want to be careful. You're not friends with everybody just because you're friends with someone. So yeah, so then the big problem at that time was the question of how do you get back into a studio and carry on from where you were before? And a big mixing console still, because they were not assignable, and we had very good reasons not to make them assignable, which if anyone's interested and there's any time I'll talk about. A big mixing console would have something around 4,000 knobs on it. I was just thinking as I walked down there, that's not counting the knobs behind the console. And there wasn't any way in the world that we could put motors on 4,000 knobs. And so what I came up with was this idea, and this is the only picture I can find of it, of making the operator into the motor and providing a means of getting the thing back where it was. So it would take a snapshot in a second or two. This is a single channel of a console, but it had to be wrapped like this because this is, 320 by 160 graphics or something is what we could get. It's a 380Z. And if it was white, then it wasn't in the right place, and you simply turned the knob until there was only one pointer, and it was gray. So that's a sort of graphical user interface, but there was only little tiny bits of graphics there. But it was very handy because it meant you could stop mixing in this place here and move to that place there. So all the groups got to go to, Montserrat or wherever and feel that they were important, which of course many of them were. Or you could rent your studio out to 2 or 3 people. People didn't have to pay to lock out the studio because it would take about 10 minutes to set this up. So there's another user interface. I don't know where I would show you that just because it's there. But it is, again, to do with modeling and immediately intuitive because it's showing you a picture of the thing you're used to. It's showing you the picture of a state, and it's showing you the picture of a desired state. And it's immediately intuitively obvious what you're going to do and why. Domain-specific, but obvious. And models of knobs and models of sliders have that characteristic. They're things we're used to interacting with all the time. What they look like is relatively unimportant. You can make them look any way you like for aesthetic reasons, but that's not what they're about. The model is of the thing that does the particular action. Yeah. So, while we were doing this, there were, in fact, user interfaces of a more graphical nature. Jerome Bruner, my professor, he had these. One of his thoughts was the initial stages of infancy when you are first growing, as a very small baby here, as you go through an inactive stage where you're interacting with things by doing things with them. And people do wave their hands around still. Then there was an iconic stage in which things looks like a picture of things, and then there was a symbolic stage where things symbolized other things. And that, it's a metaphor. It's a good metaphor. It's not, probably no one would regard it as the truth anymore. But it inspired a number of people, including a guy called Alan Kay, who invented a language called Smalltalk and an entire environment for interacting with things on the screen, and then turfed up at Xerox PARC. Now, I don't know how many people here know about Xerox PARC, but Xerox PARC invented everything. you name it, Xerox PARC invented it, but the managers at Xerox kept looking at these things, which included laser printers, the graphical user interface, Adobe came out of there, I can't remember what all else, and they say, no, Xerox is a printer company. We make copiers and printers. We don't want to make this stuff. So they didn't. They had a half-hearted attempt, and this is a UI offer thing they made, that was about late 1970s. And you can see all the elements that you're used to in any graphical user interface are pretty much there. Most importantly, the idea of documents overlapping other documents in the way that real life, and it was the desktop, but I would stress again that don't take these things literally. They're just things that map onto characteristics of the real world. People take things literally when they shouldn't. And it was all there, and that's what Steve Jobs and Bill Gates went to see, and that's why we got Lisa and Macintosh, and Apple went one way, and that's why we got Windows, which went another way. And here's an interesting thing, which if the technology is going to allow me, because now I have to bugger about, you might like to see. Let's see if pressing escape does it for you. Yeah, that's Windows 1 up there. Apparently I can point at things if I move very, very slowly. So the takeaway that Bill Gates, and this was his personal decision, took from looking at this was that it would be jolly nice to have all these graphical items, but nobody wanted objects that overlapped other objects because that was unnatural. And so if, for example, there's a clock, if I now choose, sorry about the slow and painful aspects of this. It's not wanting to cooperate, is it? Let me try clicking, see if that helps me. I think that's maybe a bridge too far. I haven't got this working in the next few seconds, I'll simply tell you about it. But I just came across yesterday the fact that you can do this, and on an ordinary screen it's quite easy. Do you want to see this, or shall I just elide it? You tell me, because I can make this happen. Yeah, make it happen? Okay, let's do our best. Yeah. No, we were there and then we aren't. Okay, this is what's going to happen now. This is painful, but it's what's going to happen now. We're going to put this here. Where am I doing for time? Oh, not so bad. Somewhere around here we're going to talk amongst yourselves. And now we're going to give you my desktop. And now we're going to give you my desktop. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we good? Apparently not. No signal. Oh, the magic. Okay, one more try. Better. Okay. Windows 1, here we are. So if I can now make this thing move in here. If I double click on this Finder icon, as you see, it's just taken half the screen. This was all the screen you got, by the way, and this was if you were lucky. This is if you had an EGA screen. So if I now wanted the calculator, there it comes, it's made, and if I wanted a second clock, which is all I've got available to me at the moment, here we go, there's an no. Well, you get the point. I can have all of these things, and I can run multiple instances, and I can very painfully give them different amounts of, oh, fuck that. I can, but only in the vertical dimension, give them different amounts of screen. And the point being here is that Bill Gates had convinced himself, and presumably convinced everybody else in Microsoft, which was like 4 people then, but whatever, that it was wrong for things to overlap other things. Steve Jobs did not make this mistake. And what he didn't see, and which they had found out, of course, very, very quickly, is that that's wrong, because we're all completely used in the world to when you put something down on top of something else, it covers it, and then you pick it up and move it. And what we're not used to is that when you put something down on the table, everything changes size. I mean, so this is nothing to do specifically with graphical user interfaces. This is to do with your models of the world. And as long as whatever you're doing fits, I'm repeating myself, but it's important, as long as whatever you're doing fits with models of the world that come naturally, then it's quite likely to work. And if it doesn't, it's quite likely not to. I remember my professor and another professor having a chat about this once. They said, what would happen if you brought up a baby where there was no correlation between what it did and what happened? It wouldn't be a very nice thing to do, but it was an interesting experiment. So yeah, so that was, oh, by the way, that was characteristic of the Bill Gates thinking. What was characteristic of the Steve Jobs thinking, who was in many ways entirely brilliant, but was characteristic of him, is that he sued Microsoft later on for stealing the very same things that they'd both stolen from Xerox PARC in the first place. They didn't get anywhere with that one. Right, so let's go back to the slides. I don't know what we're going to get here, something weird. Yeah, I was like sort of dancing with death by doing that. Extend. Okay, I don't think I'm going to make another go at that. I think it was more pain than it was worth, but I was fascinated because I had a copy of Windows 1 at the time. I thought, Jesus, what are they thinking? And it was really nice to be able to see it again in a modern machine. So in theory, we should now be able to go back to where we were. Apparently we're going to start from the first slide, but that's all right. Are we back where we were? We are. Okay. So, yeah. So then, at this point, 1980s we're talking about now, graphical user interfaces advanced by leaps and bounds, but nothing changed all that much, really, from what Xerox had done in the first place until much later on. But at this point, solid-state logic was doing terribly well. We basically owned the world of studios at that point. And we knew we had to build a digital console. And so we brought in people to be proper R&D people rather than us shambling amateurs. And what happened next was that someone came in who was really a chip designer. And he wanted to build a mixing console. He wanted to build the chips to build a mixing console because there were no chips at that time that were fast enough. And I thought about it, and I said, look, there will be in a few years, by the time we've done this. And he said, well, why don't we make a digital audio workstation instead? Because we can do that right now. This was now being 1984. And we can do it better than other people who are thinking of this. Because I was becoming aware of graphical user interfaces by then. And he said, no, if you make me build a digital audio workstation, I'll quit. And they brought in someone to be head of technology, whose main act was to bring in a large computer system with monitors that had 60 lines on them, which was very expensive in those days. But he did that to enforce the rule that no function could be longer than 60 lines. If it couldn't see it all on the page, he threw it out. And the combination of those two people meant there were no mixing consoles out of SSL that were digital for nearly 10 years. And by which time, of course, that wasn't the right answer. And I don't know if anyone here is a chip designer. That was being done in ECL, which was obsolete then. And they subsequently went on to a large famous international manufacturing company and kept on doing it. And they made 3 or 4 consoles for pretty much $1 million each. They managed to sell. But by the time I last saw them, your laptop could go faster than their entire $1 million console could. So what's the takeaway from that? Well, what was SSL doing, really? It was trying to make mixing consoles. What did it end up doing? It ended up being a chip designer. And you don't want to be doing that. As a general rule, don't build hardware except when you have to, or unless it's what you do. So I split up with SSL at that point, and we'll draw an entire veil over all of that, which wasn't nice. And one of the things I'd wanted to do was to build an editing system. because clearly editing was going to go the way that word processing had already done, and there were some good and interesting ways of doing it. I remember seeing Lucasfilm showing a really interesting, clever system involving, it was 8 copies made on video disc of the same scene, so you could cut fast between them. I saw it being demonstrated at an NAB by a bunch of people in purple jackets who talked very fast and sniffed all the time. But we were used to that. I remember being in the record plant once in Los Angeles and realizing the entire console was covered in a thin film of white dust, which is, I imagine, talcum powder. But it was, the idea was right. So when I'd split off from Solid State Logic, I had just enough money to start something else, and that was Lightworks. And what we wanted to do at that point was to build, because I was doing some editing, or rather I was watching people who were editing for me because I was doing a little bit of directing at that point. And it was so boring. But people were beginning to build editing systems, and these new things were called nonlinear editors, and sometimes still are. And the question that arises from that is, why are you calling something a nonlinear editor? What does this mean? And the answer is, because of the technology of the time. What is editing really? Editing, whether it's with words, whether it's with pictures, whether it's with sound, is putting a bunch of stuff in the right order plus rhythm. And that's what film editing actually did. Film editing was physically extremely slow and extremely painful. But conceptually, the idea was you randomly could put things from anywhere together at any time, in any way. Video editing could only be done by dubbing, so you would copy from a source machine to a destination machine, step by painful step, and if you made any mistakes, you had to wind back. If you wanted to change the length of your program, you literally wound back and rebuilt it from then on. And everyone who was designing nonlinear editing systems from Avid or EMC and others, and pretty much ever since, that paradigm is still there. There's a source machine, there is a destination machine. Obviously, you don't have to wind back anymore. But it all came from there, but it isn't what editing really was. So what were you really doing? Well, you were really trying to copy a videotape recorder. Why would you want to do that? Well, no, you really didn't want to do that. So we elected to do it instead, using the abstractions of film editing and trying to take out the nastiness of it. So there are very few pictures I can find of any of that. But the idea we had is we built a graphical user interface. We had to build our own hardware. And in fact, we built actually the very first picture, JPEG pictures that moved, we built. On a board we built. We actually subverted the chip, the first JPEG chip, in a way that its manufacturer said couldn't be done, and managed to make it play video. And we had our own graphical operating system with our own things. It was actually scriptable, and objects that you could move around on screen that occluded one another but kept existing, which winding systems didn't really do in those days. And we built, and I don't seem to have a picture of the console, which is the most important element. Oh well, if I can find one, I'll show it to you. I can't find any of the user interface now, but we had a bunch of tools that represented things that you were used to. So this represents timelines, strip views we called it, and you could do things with it. You could break the cuts, you could slide them around, you could mess with them, you could overlap them, you could dissolve between them. All these things which were unusual in those days. And in fact, there's a Lightworks still in existence, a software Lightworks, and one of the interfaces on it is still derived from that. And then you had a bunch of tools which represented things you were moderately used to. So that's actually a tools generator rather than the tools themselves. But, screwdriver is your equivalent of the settings button today. The doors make you rooms that you can go into where you can gather projects and everything to do with them in one place, and nested rooms, and so on and so forth. And you brought the objects to the things you wanted them to act on. So there would be a lightning bolt, which would nuke something once and for all. There would be cutting tools and so on. And our favorite was this one, which was our equivalent of the trash can, and we thought we were bringing it to the thing you wanted to get rid of. And we thought, what eats things? Sharks eat things. So we did a shark. And the guy who drew this was an animator, and he picked up a Microsoft ball mouse, which he'd never done in his life before. And he drew that freehand, first off. It's the first thing he ever drew, and it remained our logo forever. And there is still a magazine out there in the industry called Red Shark News, and that's where that comes from. So, how are we doing here? Oh, apparently my notes have gone again. Oh, yeah. So, that all went nicely, and people wanted it after they got used to the idea, and we sort of took over Hollywood in terms of editing for a while. We lost, ultimately, to Avid, and as a tiny side note to that, if I hadn't fallen out with my co-founder at SSL, there would be no Avid. I don't know what the world would have been like, but there'd be no Avid because SSL would have crushed them at birth. If there's anyone here who works for Avid or any aspect of Avid, I'm sorry. I mean, I'm sure you're doing much better than you would have done with us, but it is the truth. So we got to a point now, and as Julian said, it was a place that people liked to come. So we had a lot of very bright people, of whom Julian was one of the absolute brightest, although he himself thinks there are several people that are brighter than him. I don't think he's right, but I'm not going to argue with him. And those are out there in the industry even now, we're like the sort of, zombie apocalypse. So you think you've got rid of them, they pop up somewhere else. But though I'm a small companies person, our only way forward was to sell out. Don't want to be part of running something bigger. SSL got to about 600 people. It was no fun anymore. And I'm going to tell you a story, if you're all right with that. How am I doing for time? May overrun very marginally. Try not to. During this period, I got a call or met a guy who was in charge of something at a big old technology company in Silicon Valley who were sort of in our business and were nosing around for things. And I suppose I won't say what the name of the company is, but I will say it began with H and it ended in Hewlett-Packard. And they invited me to go up and talk to them about this, so I bopped up to San Jose and Mountain View, or wherever it is they are, and turned up to discover that the guy had forgotten and had gone somewhere else. And nobody knew anything about it. No one had ever told them. So they did a presentation for me about how wonderful Hewlett-Packard was. It was a PowerPoint presentation, actually, nicely done. I said politely goodbye and went away. And when I got back to my car, which I was parked facing out so I can see what I'm not going to bump into, there was a little sign on my car that said, at HP, we park facing inwards. And I thought that was tremendously symbolic. Here is a company that doesn't know how to do its own function, which was to whatever, but does know how to provide rules. So there you are. What are you really doing? Apparently providing rules. And there is a straight line between that and what happened at HP slightly later on. Let me remind myself here. So I want you to have a takeaway here. As it turns out, Hewlett-Packard, I discovered a few years later, at this point, if you were above a certain level in the executive hierarchy, you had your own full-time PowerPoint jockey who worked for nobody else but you and did nothing but PowerPoints for your presentations. And there is genuinely a line between that and the fact that they subsequently employed to run them a man out of enterprise software. Now, Hewlett-Packard is your ultimate hardware company. They're brilliant. They always were brilliant. They continue to be brilliant. They're not always perfect, but they are brilliant. He came along and he said, now Hewlett-Packard is going to be an enterprise software company. And he spent $12 billion on a company called Autonomy that was worth maybe $2 billion. He lost $30 billion off their value. He was got rid of, although he took a lot of money out himself. So what was really going on, though, I was thinking about this on the way here. It's like when you are a hammer, they say, everything looks like a nail. And in this particular case, everything looked like a nail in the coffin because they'd lost sight of what it was they were actually trying to do, because hardware was not in their DNA, which is the word that everyone likes to use now, but which I rather dislike because it's nothing to do with DNA, of course, because there are no offspring, or there are offspring, but they're not relevant to this. It's network effect. Because another thing about the convergence of cognitive psychology and neuroscience and information theory is that it becomes awfully clear that an awful lot of cognitive effects can actually be derived from first principles and very, very simple network principles, and among those being Trump and Brexit, by the way. And one of the things is that anyone in this room knows is that everything, you're trying to avoid implementation details and stick to the abstractions. And in the abstract, it doesn't matter what your medium is. It doesn't matter whether it's a neuron or a computer or a group of people. Nodes and networks conform to certain rules that are, just as there are with the little roundworm C. elegans, directed complex behavior comes from a remarkably small number of nodes, remarkably small amount of processing. It just does. So it's very much clear that the same thing happens with groups, which group psychology has been around since forever. But it's clear now that you can derive this from first principles, and you can also say things about the level of it based on the amount of processing that can be done, and most importantly, the topology and bandwidth of the network. Now, I'm not going to go into any detail here, except to say that the bottom line is that organizations tend to be stupid for bandwidth reasons, and they also tend to behave like organisms. So they're young, they take up the shape of their founders, they get middle-aged, they get old, they get ossified. HP had become ossified. They had a lot of dealings with a large broadcasting organization, which I really won't name, whose business appeared to have changed from making television programs to having meetings about how to have other meetings. This is, in a way, inevitable from the way the numbers work, and this is what I wrote this book about. And in a way, it's also to do with management as an abstraction. That the MBA, the idea that it doesn't matter what you're managing, you're just managing, is why the chap who came along to HP was able to say, oh, we're going to turn this hardware company into a software company. And it's a fallacy, of course, and I was remembering, and I'm going to modify a joke of Bob Newhart's. I'm not a fan of abstract management, but I don't want to disparage those who are fans of abstract management, and for those who are fans of abstract management, disparage means put down. And one last thing on business before I turn back to user interfaces. A friend of mine who spun out of various companies, well, we sold to Tektronix. Tektronix, we told them the HP story, they fell about laughing. They were doing wonderfully well because they'd built some really good stuff. And then they brought in management because they thought, oh, we're doing so well, we need real management. And they took out a division turning over almost $1 billion a year in 3 years, had to be sold for $25 million. And we went down in the wreckage of that, but luckily they'd allowed us to sell our shares on day one if we wanted to, so we saw it coming. So your takeaway from that is make certain you have an escape hatch. One of my friends started a company that revolutionized its industry completely, and he went the VC route. I'm just mentioning this in passing. Had 6 rounds of finance. They were sold for a lot of money. At the end of it, he, as one of the 3 founders, said he could probably buy 4 people dinner if it wasn't a very good dinner on the proceeds. What are you doing really? Be careful. You think you're making stuff. You may not be making stuff. You may be making other people rich. Just mentioning that in passing, not a very big deal. So, back to the main plot for my last rundown on this. The side effect of the modeling of the world in user interfaces is that it became all about pictures. And from that, we got skeuomorphism, I'm sure you're all familiar with skeuomorphism. If anyone isn't, does anyone not know what I'm talking about? No, of course not. Of course you do. What gradually happened is that people started having fun making things look like real things. They were intuitively easy if they looked like real things. But the making them look like real things took over and sometimes got in the way. So you got silly things like diaries whose pages turned on ring binder things, and wasted your time doing it. I think I've belabored the point enough now about why that doesn't work. But I have noticed in collecting stuff for this that the audio industry is one in which skeuomorphism is still heavily present. And why not? I mean, if anyone in this room has made any of these things, this is not intended as a criticism in any way at all. It's fun, they look nice, but it's not about the underlying principles. It's a bit of eye candy and extra stuff. So, this looks pretty much like, I don't know what it is, I just found it on the internet, looks pretty much like a console, skeuomorphism, skeuomorphism, skeuomorphism. That's a skewer. And this, I discovered this afternoon, that's a skewer with a penguin in its mouth, which is Linux skeuomorphism. So there was a reaction, I won't leave that one, it's not very nice. There was a reaction against this kind of thing, very forcibly, because it was getting silly. And oddly enough, it came out of Microsoft, who did Windows Phone, where they wanted to do these simple tiles, and there we are, it's tiles coming back, just like Bill Gates wanted all that way all those years ago in Windows 1. And it got picked up by Apple, who did it better, but nevertheless, what suddenly happened is that in the reaction against the overdoing of pictures of things, everything had to become simplified and graphicified. And what happened then, if you think about it, is that graphic design is replacing ergonomics, is replacing what you wanted to do in the first place. Visual Studio, anyone who works on Windows, develops stuff, knows Visual Studio. Between Visual Studio 10 and 12, they took out all the colors on the user interface. So all your icons that told you stuff didn't anymore. The current version of Windows, Windows 10, no longer has a bar to show you which part of your window you can grab. So you have to move your pointer around until you can find it. The current version of the Windows calculator looks graphically less interesting than the Windows 1 calculator. And most importantly here, there was a recent study that showed something of the order of 22% slower reactions of users to flat, simplified graphic user interfaces than to the traditional ones. And this was found out partly by means of this, which is eye movement tracking, which is where I came in, which shows that on the flat, I mean, I can't find a better picture than this, you won't be able to read anything. But on the, that's a sort of slightly skeuomorphic one, that's a flat one. People are spending a lot more time fixating different parts of the picture, trying to work out what it is you're trying to actually do. So in the service of making things be different and not exaggerating the picture aspect of it, they lost sight of the fact that this is ultimately about mapping models that you already have in your mind of things, whether they're real or whether they're virtual, and into ways that are natural and intuitive. And we threw away some baby in bathwater there, and I hope it will go back again. Yeah, I wanted to give you one extra point on that one. Yeah, here being, again, we are no longer in a place where we need to worry about whether the thing you're modeling ever was real. If you take an example like the floppy disk icon that people use still to save with. Now, I don't suppose anyone has seen a floppy disk in the last umpty years. I know I haven't. I expect there are people in here who've never seen one ever. But everyone knows what the floppy disk icon means. It's become an object in its own right. No reason to piss about with it. All right, last couple of things. No, give me my notes back. Thank you. Yeah, physical controllers, good things, like physical controllers. They allow you to map simultaneously things on screen, things in the real world, faster, particularly for professionals. Don't want to go into that now. Yeah, after Lightworks, I had an authentic disaster with a loudspeaker company. We made intelligent loudspeakers that measured the room. That's the only time I've done any actual audio development. I had to pick up the pieces. And I will tell you this, because this particular room, I was handed this function which had been developed from MATLAB for the filtering that was being done, 870 lines. And I worked on it for a while, and I reduced it to 18 lines. And if it had been in Soul, it would have been 1 line. It was a Butterworth filter, second-order Butterworth filter. The reason it was 850 lines is because it had been copied out of MATLAB, and I discovered almost all of it was statements with a 0 in it somewhere after a multiply sign. Every one of those statements evaluated to 0. The whole bloody lot of them. What's your takeaway from that? Don't work with idiots. So my most recent one in this context is Codex Digital, which does workflow and recording, high-quality recording for the film industry for digital cameras. Because in the early aughts, digital cameras were coming along, and one of the other brilliant people out of Lightworks, a chap called Delwyn Holroyd, had the idea of building a box that you could throw everything in from a digital camera, because it was all being recorded onto videotape in the form of video, and then redigitized. Ridiculous. It was digital, it was turned into digital video, and then it was turned back into files again. So he said, why don't we build a box that you can put the output of a camera in, and then get it out in any file format you like. So you just plug in, it's a network device. If you're an editor, you get MP4 file. Well, they weren't editing them in those days, but whatever it was. You know, you get DPX files if you're an effects person. You get the audio files, because we record the audio as well. And so we built that, and in those days, this is the first one, it was a very nice device, and it's full of design signifiers about how, because people were frightened of digital, you know, what if we lose our stuff we're used to film? So this is full of signifiers that say this is very safe, you're going to like it. These are machined, you know, literally out of a block of aluminium. We were doing that before that was common. But it was huge. I mean, it was 80 pounds. Really couldn't sell many because they were too big. So I'm telling you this story because it's of relevance to my central theme. So we decided to, we had to build a smaller one, and there was a limit to how small we can make it. So what we designed, I'm sorry, I think I lost my mouse, was we decided to design something that would be lost, as it were, in the noise. Now this is a picture of a typical studio camera with only some of the gubbins that you would attach to such a camera attached to it. You can see there's a hell of a lot of stuff there. A fully kitted out rig, and I couldn't find one really fully kitted out, that was another one. There's probably a ton of equipment attached to this thing, so we thought to ourselves, why don't we make a little box? There it is, roughly the size of a sandwich box, would record high quality, full quality video, well, digital, and spang it all out in exactly the same form. And everyone will like that because it's about 1% of the entire size of the stuff they're used to doing. And it failed completely. Total catastrophe. Nobody wanted it. And the reason is because if you ask yourself, what am I doing really? Or if you ask a cinematographer, deep down, what they're doing really is being film people. Not so true now, was absolutely true in 2009. And film, as you know, goes in things on top of cameras. And in their souls, what they wanted was something that went on top of the camera. If it didn't go on top of the camera, they didn't want it because it wasn't really film. And this, I will note in passing, is another thing that you can actually predict from first principles from network theory, amplification of low-level impulse. It's known as xenophobia. But I'm not going there now. So, yeah, I think that's most of the things I wanted to say. The only other thing that I can give you as a takeaway from that particular thing is that Codex is doing very well these days, nice most of the big films, the Marvel films, those sorts of things are all done using codecs. And somewhere I've got a picture of one on a camera, and until the very latest ones, they were still quite big. They weren't much smaller than that, but they're on top of the camera, so people like them. Is that the business, turns out that people have made an entire business out of making stuff difficult again. Delwyn's idea was you could plug in and get any kind of file you wanted right now, right there, but people get paid thousands of dollars a day for sitting there making files. So instead of using what the thing they can do, they take it away and they turn it through long, complicated steps into whatever it is you could have had in the first place and sell their services for a lot of money. It's an entire profession. I'm not going to say anything more about that, except this is the definition of the perverse incentive. So, yeah. Wrote a book, could go on for 4.5 hours about that, not going to. Here we are. So when Julian opened this entire thing, he did a quote, not the quote I've always loved about give a man a fish and he will eat for a day, teach a man to fish and he'll eat for a life. And I thought I'd give you the version. It's not relevant really, but I thought I'd give you the version from my late friend Terry Pratchett, who always came up with something good. He said, give a man a fire and he will be warm for a day. Set a man on fire and he will be warm for the rest of his life. So, you know, I hope I've been able to keep you warm for an hour anyway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Do you want to do questions?
Yeah, of course. Assuming anyone has got any questions after all of that.
Just quickly, because we're a bit over time. But,
yeah, 1 minute over time. I didn't do badly.
I can't actually see.
No, I don't think so. I think they've been bludgeoned into submission.
I think everyone wants a beer, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone's itching for that. But you can't have one yet because. Sorry. Oh, is there a?
Yeah.
Oh, we've got one.
Hey, just interested in of your perspective on skeuomorphism, especially as a psychologist, because I think the whole idea behind it is that people are really obsessed with familiarity, and things that are familiar to people make them more accessible. And so logically, I guess you would try to make sure that social culture would permeate into digital culture. And why is that bad in your perspective?
Do you think it's bad?
I don't necessarily think it's bad. I think that a lot of times it doesn't reach everyone, right? If there's an image of a floppy disk and you have a 20-year-old who's using a computer, they probably won't know what a floppy disk is. But the people who aren't 20 it might give them some sort of reference to understand something that might be difficult otherwise.
I think the key is it's not so much as to what the particular referent is, it's to how familiar it can be in the context of other parts of your life. So I have a 17-year-old daughter who can't understand why I get irritated at the kinds of things I get irritated by, because she's grown up in a world where user interfaces change on her all the time, and it's just an object like any other object, and that's completely reasonable. I just say it would be an even better object if it didn't change on you all the time, and if it bore some relation to other aspects of your life. And the same is true of the ways in which virtual social networks map physical networks. I mean, these are all variations on a theme, but not, I think, a theme that anyone particularly wants. It's 15 minutes of that or get beer. And I know what the answer is.
Thank you.
But I take the point. But I mean, the single and key thing is that it is literally true that we live in our models of the universe and in nothing else. There is a real sense in which you are your model of the universe. And that we know quite a lot about from the ground up, from, as it were, the retina in, if you're talking about vision, but is also something that cognitive psychology knows quite a lot about from the top down. And the big takeaway on the top down is that what you think of as your executive unitary self, this is me making decisions, is almost certainly not that, but a sort of after the fact justification of what a bunch of lower level things already did, not only decided, but did. And then you sort of see, the top yourself sort of sees what you just did and then decides that that was me deciding to do it. And there's a lot of work on this, which I won't bore you with. But so this is almost impossible to take on board intuitively, because obviously here we are sitting inside our own heads being ourselves. But nevertheless, it's true, and a lot of things flow from it. Again, none of which you want to hear about right now. But I don't know if that goes anywhere close to your question. I'm past the point where I can do a very good job of that. I wish it were otherwise.
Okay, everyone's itching to get to the bar, and I'm afraid that's not going to happen for a minute because I want to invite JB up to do some closing words. But yes, before he gets up, one big hand for Paul, please.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jules. So this is the end of ADC 2018. And I would like to thank a lot of people, all the speakers and keynote speakers. So please join me in giving them a big round of applause. Also, we had 10 or 12 volunteers who helped smooth all the organization, and Sophie and Josh, who were instrumental in making sure that everything goes smoothly. So I'd like to thank them again. And the AV did a great job at streaming and helping making sure that all of this is on the internet right now as we speak. So thank you, Codex and Enrico and the team. I got a few more for you. All the sponsors. So it's really, well, without them we couldn't have done this. So sponsors, a big hand for them. Right, I think we're going to stop there, actually. So, announcement about what's happening now. It's not completely the end. It's the end for the recorded part of ADC, but there's a non-recorded part, an unofficial, with Timur leading tonight the open mic, which is going to happen here after we have a few beer and pizza downstairs. At 7 it starts. We may run out of the money we've put behind the bar, so you may have to pay for your beers tonight. But the cash bar will be open. And if you're quick, you may catch some of the last free ones. So, yeah, do you have anything else to add before we officially end ADC?
No, I think everyone's just keen to get down there, get to the bar. The lightning talks are going to be really good fun, so make sure you're up here at 7 sharp. And no, it's been an amazing couple of days. I hope you've all had a really, really great time, and we'll see you all next year. Thanks very much.